Let me just start by just appreciating a couple of people in particular. I mean, events like this and ministries like this just can't exist without a lot of people being members of the body who are hands and feet and toes and eyes and making stuff like this happen. And then there's always a couple of folks within that larger number that are just doing things that without their contribution, again, this just doesn't exist. And so I just want to thank Farrell, I want to thank Belinda. I know these guys spend a lot of time praying and asking the Lord for direction and ways to serve you at this unique season of your life. And kind of what we're doing today reflects just the conviction that, you know, life travels through seasons and there's unique needs in those seasons. Our perspective, the way our faith is operating, you know, it's hard to be naive when you're on the older end of life, but there's a whole ministry to younger people that's full of addressing issues that are naive. It's hard to be cynical when you're younger, but there's a whole ministry need for, we become cynical as we get older because ideas don't work and life didn't turn out the way we thought, etc. So there's unique things happening all the time that show up in our age group, and one of them is generational differences. And that's not new, right? Generational differences have always existed, which the most humbling thing I can say to any of us, because most of us in this room are baby boomers, right? So I'm the last year of the baby boomer generation. I'm 1964. As a matter of fact, I think I've got a generational slide. Here we go. I think I know some of these people. I don't know where we got that from, but all right, so here's your generation groups. I'm not going to go into a lot about generations, but this is who we're talking about in terms of when you see these little titles used. Baby boomers, you're born from 1946 to 1964. Then Gen X is going to be what comes after that. That's their age group there. But most of what we're going to talk about today, and this is not an insult to the Gen X guys, most of what's happening in our world is being driven by the two generations below the Gen X guys. The Gen X guys, I have to say, again, no insult to the Gen X. That's why you're called Gen X. They can't come up with a name for you. You're just along for the ride. The baby boomers they created their own wake, they did their own thing, and you're along for the ride with the baby boomers. And then the millennials came behind you, and they're a bigger presence than the baby boomers are. And so you're along for the ride with them. And the Gen Z guys are postured to not like anything that anybody before them has done. So we don't know what they're going to do yet. But here's the humbling part. In our lifetime, even what exists and some of the ideas we'll interact with today, nobody has been a bigger cultural force for difficulty and trouble than the baby boomers. A lot of the ideas that we'll interact with today, they get their launching pad, they get their introductory philosophical angles from the 60s and 70s. So the cues that were in our generation that show up later on, we may not like a lot, but can you remember our parents didn't like what we were about? And they felt like they were alienated, hostile, the difficulties that were present, etc. That's what the generation before baby boomers was feeling as well. So this is not new in many ways. What is new is the information age. Ideas get formulated, reinforced, trafficked, shared at a much higher level than ever. And so things that were shocking become common in a few weeks, it feels like. I mean, just a matter of no time. And that's making us a little bit challenged in terms of interacting with those ideas. So I'm gonna move through some material here just for a moment, just to frame some things with us. But what I want to do with most of our time is just interact with you and kind of some Q&A time. And so maybe as we move through some of this material, you can write some thoughts in the margin, just maybe a question that you have, an experience that you're going through in these categories, and we'll seek to interact with that. As Farrell has already said, I'm not the answer man for these things. I can stare at stuff and tell you about what I just looked at, but it doesn't mean I can solve these problems. And let me tell you another thing that I'm not going to do this morning, because I am going to put my finger on a couple of things that I think are critical for us to own, and I'm going to say that to us pastorally, not as a sociologist. Totally lost my train of thought. I don't even know what I was about to tell you. Yeah. Hey, I'm in good company, aren't I? So why were we here again? All right, it'll come back to me, right? Probably not. Oh, this is life. All right, well, let me do this. Look at this material here with me. I'm going to move through some of it quickly. I know. Now I know what I was going to say. All right, so we're going to interact with, and you'll especially see this on page 2 of your notes. We're going to interact with a whole page of new vocabulary. Here's what I'm not going to do. And I'm not going to do it because we don't have time to do it, number one. I'm not going to do it, number two, because you listen to me preach every week, almost. You don't have to wonder what I believe about the things we're going to talk about. If you do wonder, you must sleep through the messages on Sundays. Because we interact with these issues a lot because they're in our culture big time. And so what I'm not going to do is hold a rally here for all of us to get mad and bothered by all these issues that we don't like. Can I just tell you, I don't like them either. All right, can I get that out of the way? I think most everything I'm going to describe here has its own version of wrongness to it. And I say it's wrong not because I'm a baby boomer and I don't like your style. I'm going to say it's wrong because it's not biblical. And it violates something that God has said. But what I'm not going to do is unpack how all these things are unbiblical. I'm not going to do that today. If you want to make an appointment, we can do it together. We do another session on that. I'm more interested in how we as a generation are interacting with the generations that come behind us. Both from the how do we survive that, and then how do we stay on mission toward them. All right, so that's my main concern today. All right, so look at your notes there with me. Here's a thought. Carl Trueman is a professor. He does also some pastoral ministry. I quoted from him in the service today. He wrote a book about the strange new world that we're in. This is an article related to it. He says, the world has shifted under our feet. New notions about selfhood challenge Christians' views, and we've found ourselves in a hostile place where it's dangerous to challenge the new status quo. To object to same-sex marriage, for example, is in the moral register of the day not substantially different from being a racist. The era when Christians could disagree with the broader convictions of the secular world and yet still find themselves respected as decent members of society is coming to an end, if indeed it hasn't ended already. The truth is that the last vestiges of a social imaginary shaped by Christianity are rapidly vanishing, and many of us are even now living as strangers in a strange new world. All right, I've got way too many thoughts in my head, so I'll try and leave some time here. But, the strange new world, one thing for us as Christians that it would help for us to pay attention. We are a unique experiment on planet Earth. We got to participate in this nation called America that borrowed a lot of biblical ideas to form its cultural ideas. So what started off looking really, really Christian is moving away from that. All right, now, do you recognize when you read your Bible, you're reading the opposite of that when you read the setting of the Bible? The setting of the Bible is not a very Christianized, moral world with Christian-type ideas in the government and in the common culture, and there's this slow decline happening, and the church is interacting with that. That's not the first century church. The first century church is irrelevant to Roman life and Greek life, And then the Jews in the midst of that setting have some morality that sound like the Christians could agree with them, and they could agree a little bit with the Christian way of life. But for the most part, the culture doesn't want to be Christian. It's not Christian. It doesn't acknowledge Christianity. It's not moving away from Christianity. It thinks you're a weirdo, and it doesn't recognize it at all. So when you and I go to interpret the Bible into our setting today, remember, we're the opposite of the first century. And I say that's significant because you and I can start formulating ideas like, if we don't go back to the way things were, if we don't go back to the good old days when morality was this way, as though that's going to rescue us. You recognize the first century church turned the world upside down. And they had nothing to go back to in its culture. Zero. The culture was not on board with Christianity or Judaism or anything. They were the weirdos. So before you and I gasp for air and over panic in a moment like this, we're not cultural reformers. We have a gospel to present to the world. It interacts with people differently than cultural ideas. So we're not trying to reform the government, reform behaviors, and reform moralism. We're trying to bring the gospel to the world. So just pick up on a couple of those elements. But I will say this, that I put in your outline, there's the strange new world effect. As I'm having conversations with seniors ministry members, and I hear this a lot more. I just put some bullet points of conversations that I've had. The feeling of being canceled, the feeling of being disrespected, the feeling of being in touch with a younger generation's irritations about your ideas are present. And it's starting to show up in very personal ways within your own families. Your children can feel this way to you. Your grandchildren can feel this way to you. And the reality of it is you're spending less time with them. You don't want to be around them, and they don't want to be around you because it's awkward. And conversations go south, and we start talking about things, and somebody's feelings get in the conversation, and little sensitivities are there. Right? Remember, the generations behind us, they have been raised with different sensitivities than the ones that you had. You were taught to be sensitive to certain things, and you were taught to ignore other things. Right, so I've had some of you guys mention to me that younger generations will react to the way in which this generation talks about racial things. Because our generation was taught to not be sensitive about racial things. Their generation was taught to be very sensitive about racial things. Right, so there's a difference there, and I also say there's a right and a wrongness there as well. I think our generation was taught wrong. I think we interacted with racial issues way too casually. I can remember growing up, this is the 60s and 70s, so I'm probably 1970-ish, 71-ish. And we would go to have dinner every week at Morrison's Cafeteria. How many guys remember Morrison's Cafeteria? It's now Royal Olds, I think, or something. Or Royal Olds. There's no Oldsmobiles either. I'm dating myself terribly today. Royal Honda. But you know what I didn't pick up on something that happened until I got older, until I became a Christian, but until I had eyes to see racial issues differently. There was a guy who waited on us every week. We knew him by name. He came to our family, and he would serve our table, and but he was he was black, and he was overly humble. I didn't pick up on that as a kid. That's just the way you were. You were kind of the help. And so there was this interaction that was very deferring, very respectful, almost too respectful, kind of a demeanor as he'd come to the table, interact with my dad, and interact with the table setting. And I didn't know what was at play in those moments till I got older, and I realized there was real racial tensions and issues at play in what made him feel like he needed to interact with us that way. So our generation was very casual in that category. And it becomes a point of alienation for our younger people to interact with us when we sound insensitive. You can sound insensitive by saying something like, and you say it real casually. I was driving home today, this black guy pulled out in front of me and cut me off, and blah, 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 blah. Why'd you say black guy? You didn't even hear yourself say it. Your kids did. Your grandkids do. And they're bugged by it. Because the world has taught them not only to look for it, but to despise it as well. And now you sound like something that they despise. And these kinds of things are coming into the conversations that you have. Now, everything I just said about race is also true about politics, about views on social issues that are out there today. They're being taught to pay attention to these things, to feel a certain way about them, to advocate for them, to allow for them, et cetera, et cetera. And then they hear us, who comes from a generation where things are black and white where we come from. There's certain issues that when we interact with them, that's stinking wrong. You didn't do that, and immediately we're postured for a war. And we want to engage that topic in a way that is part of this alienation difficulty. But I'm picking up on for you guys, and this is just a ministry element for all of us, where this is making you feel more isolated. You're not with your families the same way you would have been years ago or generations before you were with, because there's a hostility and a difficulty in that. And it's not just the issues. There's also something happening in our information age where younger generations don't come to older generations to seek out information. They just go find it themselves. They read something, they Google something. So there's just a little bit less a daughter calling a mom and saying, Mom, what would you do with this or that? Or seeking out somebody older in that category. They're just really self-sufficient. And again, what that makes you feel like is alienated and isolated. So there's something happening just for us as we care for one another in this age group, that please pay attention. The people in this room that you're a part of their lives, they feel more disconnected from the people that matter to them than they have before. And we have to help each other with that in the body of Christ. Colin Hansen does a podcast, and he said this: a recent article in New York Magazine included this bombshell. Roughly 30% of American women under 25 identify as LGBT. For women over 60, that figure is less than 5%. Now, I can't find anyone who believes the number can really be that high, and I totally agree. I don't think it is. To acknowledge such a dramatic shift in such a short period of time would be nothing short of a world-changing revolution. And Truman, the other fellow I just quoted from, locates the sexual revolution within a broader change in views of the self and identity. Hold on to those two words, because that's our real trouble. It's not the stuff you think is the trouble. This is what's creating the trouble at the surface level. Self and identity. I've heard Carl say that apologetics used to be about explaining the church to the world, but now it's more about explaining the world to the church. And that's why we're having this meeting today, to try and see if we can understand what on earth is going on. So the two things I'm going to stick this under is the mess we're in and the mission we're on. Right, so the mess we're in, I'll try and do this quickly just to stir some thought. A new world of values around us, generational rebellion, and the philosophy beneath the value shifts. And I want to make sure we hear that one pretty clearly. But here's your new vocabulary, right? And again, there's all kinds of problematic, unbiblical issues in these categories. But this is the new vocabulary that you and I are interacting with, that our younger people are interacting with differently. Gender and sexuality. Common to hear: transgender, gender fluid, cisgender, gender dysphoria, non-binary, same-sex attraction, same-sex marriage. I mean, it freaks us out, right? When a young 8-year-old comes home from school and talks about their non-binary friend. And you're having to ask them, what exactly, is that like a computer coding thing? Binary, non-binary? This is flowing into the roles of men and women in society the roles of men and women in the church, the roles of husbands and wives in families. So you're going to be interacting with this conversationally when the way in which your sons and daughters do marriage and the roles that they play and the things that don't even rise as a concern for them. The issues of social disparity and inequality, social reform, social justice. These are common things for us to interact with in the news. Critical race theory, race relations and sensitivities, engaging history. I don't know, I pay attention to this stuff. I'm a little nerdy. Just last week, the interpretation of who is with the United States and the West and NATO and who is not in the Ukrainian issue. And there's a bunch of nations who are not with the West. And this is what's being brought out in the news. And you know the reason why they're not with the West? Because the West is a bunch of colonizers. The West has a history of colonizing the world. The Europeans, America, they colonize. Russia never did that to us, and these nations have come right out and said that. And so there is an engaging of history that finds its way into, hey, who's for the Ukrainian Russian war situation? What's your opinion about that? How should you interact with that? There's stuff at work here that you and I don't get. It's like, I wouldn't have been thinking that way, but I guess you guys are thinking that way. Political polarization. We've always had conservative and liberal, but now we've got progressives, we've got alt-right. Our generation is shocked that there's this thing called socialism and Marxism, and people talk about that like it's not a third head. My dad was born in 1918. I was taught at a very early age how to feel about socialism, communism, and Marxism. I'm going to explain to you in just a minute why that makes sense to a younger generation. And it doesn't make any sense to us. But before you take up arms in either direction, can everybody just at least grant me this grace? Can you acknowledge with me that democracy is not a biblical form of government? You okay with that? I know you could run out of here or throw something at me. You don't find democracies in the Bible. You don't find the Bible telling people to stand up democracies. Now, do I like democracy? Yes, except I don't like this one part. I'm informed by the doctrine of depravity. I don't like the idea that the majority of depraved, fallen, sinful, corruptible people are in charge. Do you like that? But if the alternative is one dude with a whole lot of power, I know he's depraved as well, and I know he's got lots of problems and selfishness, and he's going to turn the world upside down in a dictatorship or some kind of other tribal type approach to life. I'm not going to like that either. But before you think democracy will rescue us, be very careful that you understand the Bible nowhere teaches to put our hope in democracy. But America has taught us that. And I'm going to show you that's just a little bit challenging. There's woke issues today. We're familiar with that word. The words of oppression, abuse, authoritarianism, privilege, protest. This is in common conversations we're having. Cancel culture. I still haven't quite figured out what gaslighting is, but it is a term. Virtue signaling. Anger and outrage. This is what you and I are navigating in our conversations with others. So let me just make two critical points of understanding. One would be understanding the philosophy operating in our culture. There's a reason why people feel so strongly about what they feel strongly about. And then secondly, I'll just look at understanding the inner desperation that is in humanity that drives this. And that's an easy biblical thing for us to pick up. But let me ask you this. Why does understanding this matter? Right? I don't have to understand it all to tell you right now I disagree with it. I think it's stupid. I think it doesn't work. I think it's ungodly. I don't have to understand it at all to say all those things. And I would say all those things about most of this stuff. Why does it matter that I seek to understand this? All right, let me change this meeting for a second. Let's say in 6 months, all of us are getting on a boat together and we're going to reach an unreached people group on an island. And we're going to bring them the gospel. And in the next 6 months, we're going to spend time getting to learn them and getting to know about them. You'd be interested in that, wouldn't you? You wouldn't just be saying, hey, well, no, just whatever. We just bring the gospel. When people are missionaries to a foreign culture, they recognize words mean something different to you than they do to me. I have to learn your language. Your way of life and your practices. I don't understand. Why do you do that? Why do women do that? Why do men do that? I'd have to learn that. I'd have to learn the value system and where it came from. How long has it been around? What are your traditions? How have you thought your way into being in this setting right now? I would learn all those things because my goal is to build bridges into their lives for the sake of the gospel. And I recognize part of me has to go to where they are in order to interact with who they are. Right? So if I said that we're going to go to a people group on an island somewhere, we'd all get that. But what if we're going to travel as baby boomers into the lives of millennials and Gen Z? Well, the same truth applies. We're going to have to learn their language, their ways of life, their practices. We're going to have to learn to interact with them for the sake of the gospel, right? So this really, really matters. So let me install one big thought here that will probably answer a lot of questions guys may have today. And that's just first the philosophy of the day. And I'm going to try and do this quickly. Philosophy of the day, I put the little note next to it. The evolution of freedom and individuality. The evolution of freedom and individuality. Freedom, we like that word, don't we? We like the word liberty. Our founding documents come from somewhere. Casting off tyranny, that's in our founding documents. Right? The Declaration of Independence sounds a certain way because it was written at a certain time. Right? It's a late 1700s document. If you precede that, before the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution, you have Enlightenment, you've got a lot of philosophical ideas that are informing humanity about what they do. And a big treasure was freedom from oppression. That's not new. That's been around for a few hundred years. Freedom from oppression. What it started as was more your peasants in France who wanted to be free from the oppression of landowners and the bourgeoisie, people who had power. So they start this, hey, what about us moment? Sound like hashtag Me Too a little bit? They just didn't have any devices. What about us and the people who have all the power, who have been controlling us, manipulating us, and hurting us all these years? That finds its way to England. Same ideas begin to be touted there. And so you got this King George presence of somebody who oppresses you and puts things on you and turns your life into something. And then this idea comes along that, hey, we have rights too. And you went from the right in the 1700s, 1800s, the right of a collection of people. And that eventually comes even in the 1900s, the civil rights movement. It was not about any one person. It was about a group of people. So whether you were peasants or whether you were civil rights, the history of freedom and liberty was about people finding freedom from oppression, but the thinking was groupthink. It's not groupthink anymore. Today, which just makes sense, the doctrine of freedom has found its way to the individual. I have the right. I have the right to be and to do what I want to be. And all the oppressors, the haters out there, need to get the heck off of me. Need to get out of my way. As a matter of fact, the laws of the land need to support my dreams and what I want. Now, understand, this is why we need to tread carefully. That sounded great when it was about a whole collection of people. Now try and chase down every individual who wants to do their own thing their own way and make that work. Well, I can tell you right now, it's never going to work. Right? The culture will never pull that off. It'll be nothing but frustrating. We are in for some difficult days. But understand, those of us who applaud and appreciate, we love American democracy and freedom, and I do too, but did you read the documents carefully? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have the right to pursue happiness. And for me, happiness is LGBTQ. And the documents that govern the land that you and I share together tell me I have the right to pursue happiness. Oh, and by the way, God gave me that right. That's what the Declaration of Independence has taught me. And then you read a little further into this document. I just listen. If you were writing the Declaration of Independence today, and you were an LGBTQ member or whoever, right? Listen to the wording here. It'll explain why our country feels a little bit the way it does. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, new rules, new ideas, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I can't pick two bigger buzzwords to use today than those two. Safety. Did any of y'all go to a school where there were safe zones in it? Did you ever hear the word trigger when you were growing up? I think trigger was a horse when I was growing up. You know, Roy Rogers, I think that's where that came from, right? But now things can be said in a classroom that could trigger something, and students need to have a safe place. See, this is the language of where freedom and liberty kind of goes. I have the right to feel safe, and I don't feel safe with people speaking this way about that thing or that topic. I don't feel safe by that, and it's in the way of my happiness. Right? This is the Declaration of Independence I'm reading from. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, like, I know in this room won't take a poll, but a bunch of us don't like the hashtag Me Too thing. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future society. All right, humble ourselves, baby boomers. We did that in the 60s and 70s. We told the generations before us, your form of how you manage sexuality, don't put that on us. We're going to cast off your government. We're going to sleep in VW vans, and we're going to live with communes in California, and we're going to do everything that our generation before us didn't do. We're going to cast off your government. We're going to stick it to the man. We're not going to be told what the establishment. And you remember all of our vocabulary? Right? And we had a cause, man. We were trying to find liberty. All right, so I'm just going to install a little bit of sympathy here. That's what the generations behind us are doing. They're doing exactly the same thing. They just have a different list of vocabulary. And they're after some things that are a little bit different. Their value systems have shifted so much. So here's philosophically, right? I wanted to make sure and get you this, because philosophically, if you want to understand what am I interacting with when I interact with all these ideas, and I'm going to do some questions in just a second. Here's the dominant underlying philosophy. Owen Strachan, in his chapter in a book called Design for Joy, he says, we've all been told this kind of message over and over and over again. You are amazing. You are a star. You can be whatever you want. There are no limits in life for you. Many of us have heard this formulation so many times that it's second nature to us. We naturally assume it's true. This kind of thinking is embedded in modern culture. It's not just a cheesy mantra, though. It's a spiritual system in its own right. In my book, Risky Gospel, I even gave it a name. Narcissistic Optimistic Deism. The basic view of narcissistic optimistic deism is this, and you can hold back your amens because I know this is going to be, life is fundamentally about me. I deserve for life to get better and to allow me to achieve all my dreams. God exists to bless me and make my dreams come true. Right, if I had the pastoral team to stand up and say, how many times have somebody come sit in your office and use the phrase, God would want me to be happy? And what's coming next is he would therefore not want me to do something hard or self-denying or sacrificial or involve suffering. He would want me to have my dreams fulfilled. Where did you learn all this stuff? partly from the Declaration of Independence. Right? And I don't say it to be, oh, Keith, you're this anti-American. No, I just want you to recognize ideas exist no matter what label you hide them in. This is the individual ultimately standing under the authority of God saying, you will not tell me what to be and what to do. You will not tell me where the boundaries are. I have the right to be happy. And that's what's in our young people right now. So if you sound like you're taking away their right to be happy, you're going to have a different conversation on your hands than you were prepared for. Because that's what they're listening for, right? They're just not listening for what's your stance on same-sex marriage. They're listening for whether or not you're about to take away people's happiness. And you don't even give a rip because it isn't from your generation. It's not the way you think. He goes on, he says, if this sounds like a Disney-fied Christianity, well, that's because it is. All that's missing is a little flying insect with a magic wand. A major outcome of this way of thinking is this. You end up believing that you don't have any limits. And that if someone suggests that you do, that's a bad thing. People who might offer constructive criticism are in reality haters. They're in the wrong and you're in the right. Because if your heart feels it and wants it, it must be good. This perspective has influenced the way people look at their bodies and lives. They say, I can be whatever I want to be. Being a man or a woman doesn't end up meaning anything. There's no structure or order to life. There are many outworkings of this problem. If a couple is married and the man doesn't feel like working, then he stays home. If the wife doesn't really want to spend much time with her kids, she doesn't. If a teenage boy feels like a woman, then he's free to embrace womanliness. If a 20-something woman is attracted to other women, then she should act on that instinct. Narcissistic, optimistic deism tells us that whatever we want to do or be, that's great. God is the great cheerleader in the sky. No matter what we do, he's for us. He endorses all our appetites and commends all our instincts. And so that's the philosophy that's creating the news items that you and I are interacting with and in our kids' and our grandkids' lives. It's coming from that. So helpful just to give a little homework to ourselves to understand how that's going to sound when I go to have a conversation and you start sounding to the generation like you're a hater too. You're against people being happy. This is where you're probably hoping I'm going to say something that fixes this. I don't know how to fix that. Because there is a dimension that, and you'll notice, there's a reason why I say some things on Sunday morning, like what I said this morning about God's not looking for customers. Because the whole world is redefining God. God's a cheerleader. God's supposed to come alongside whatever it is that we come up with. And he's just happy about whatever makes us happy. So if I don't like to worship God that way, he gets that. He gets us. I hope that goes in a good direction, that whole he gets us thing. I hope it does. Because it's got one foot in what the world wants to hear and another foot in the Bible. And that's always a risky thing. You can slip on a banana field when you put your foot in the world and say, he gets us. What does that mean? Are you about to say he gets us? That we are so blind and destructive and bent on ourselves and alienated from God and hostile to him that he knew the only way to save us was to come as a human being and die in our place? Is that what you're about to tell me? He gets us? Or are you about to validate that he gets me? Some people are this way, some people are that way, some people are LGBTQ, some people are this. So there is no morality. Is that where this is going? I don't know, if you're watching the commercials on these things. But this is what's in our conversations with our kids and with the next generation. All right, I'm going to take some questions, but I just want to point something out about why this matters to us. Because we're on a mission together. We're on a mission for this generation. We are about to get on a boat and go reach these people, this unreached people group, right? And what's going to guide our mission? Our views on vaccines and politics and what candidate you should and shouldn't vote for? Our political ideas, is that what we're ready to go to war on? So I hear my kids get left of this idea in the politics. Man, I'm all over that. I'm all over that. We're on a mission for the sake of the gospel. And that's getting lost. Our world is making lots of noise about something else besides the gospel. So we're gonna have to figure out how to stay on task, right? So here's a couple of thoughts, and I'll take some questions. Psalm 78, verse 1. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation. What are we going to tell them? The glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children. The testimony God put in the nation of Israel, which more than anything else points to a Savior who one day will come to take away your sins and restore you to God. That testimony is what we're transferring to the generation coming behind us. That the next generation, verse 6, the next generations might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. So I love that phrase because it helps me to know when I'm talking to somebody, where am I trying to get them to set their hope? What point am I making? What argument am I having? And where am I trying to get them to set their hope? That's a test for us as we communicate with the generation that's at war with our thinking and our ways of doing things and our traditions and some of our religious convictions as well. What am I trying to convince them of? Well, I want them to put their hope in God. And that's revealed in the gospel, how they can have a relationship with this living God. Do you agree with me about this policy? That this is where taxes should be done this way, and welfare should be done that way, and racial issues should be handled this way. And you're not going to vote for this guy, right? You're going to vote for this guy, right? And that's where the conversation lives. And we can talk about some of those things. But you've got to figure out, am I talking about those things and at the expense of being able to share the gospel in that setting? Because I'm dying on hills that aren't my primary hills. Right? And so that's a concern I have. We are in a mess as a culture. Don't see that going away anytime soon. I think we're all going to outlive the mess. It will still be here when we're gone. But we are on a mission. And quite honestly, if we'll do a little homework, we'll find out the first century was in a bigger mess. The Christianity that needed to be lived out in the first century was so much harder than what you and I have to do. So alienated, so different in the first century. But they were on a mission, and they turned the world upside down, didn't they? Pretty impressive. All right, so I'm going to stop there. You got some other stuff, you can read that.